one. Now, my sort of route eventually to giving up animal products altogether was probably pushed forward by a number of books that I read. And I just, if you haven't read these, I would kind of recommend them, actually. I read this a while ago, and Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall says at the bottom here, everyone who eats flesh should read this book. This book is mostly about the ethics of breeding and producing animals to feed us. And it's quite a strong book. It's quite an awakening sort of book to realise just what the meat industry and the dairy industry is like. A couple of things I remember in particular from this book. One of them was he said that Kentucky Fried Chicken has caused more suffering than any other company in the history of mankind. Kentucky Fried Chicken, actually I told some of my pupils this fairly recently, and two of them, quite interestingly, went to Kentucky Fried Chicken and put this to them and came back with a load of leaflets from Kentucky Fried Chicken. But they pointed out to me that the word chicken does not appear anywhere in the leaflets. It's all KFC, which made me wonder just how much of their food is actually from chickens. I don't know. They slaughter in excess of 2 million chickens every day. So it's about just getting on towards 1 billion a year. Now that's an awful lot of chickens. It seems obvious to me you can't produce 2 million chickens every day in anything like a humane sort of way. One of the other things he talked about in here was that if you've got a piece of beef, a piece of pork, a piece of lamb on your plate, it is possible that those animals were raised humanely and that they were killed humanely, and therefore the stress and the suffering to get it onto your plate might have been minimal. I think the word might is quite important there. But he said if you've got a piece of fish on your plate, there has to have been stress and suffering at some point. And I think that was the point when I decided to stop eating fish altogether. I also have personal concerns about overfishing and so on, the way we're devastating fish stocks, and that was an important part of it as well. So, that's a good book. This is an interesting book as well. I don't know whether you've come across this. I mean, omnivores are almost non-existent in nature. It's usually said that humans and rats are the only two true omnivores. And this guy, Michael Pollan, put forward the idea, well, actually, if we are omnivores and we can eat whatever we want more or less, how do we choose? To be fair, he wasn't really advocating that we shouldn't. He was more concerned about how the food actually arrived on our plates. And it says there, actually, a natural history of 4 meals. I looked at the copy of the book that I've got, because I thought it was only 3, and I can only find 3 in the book. However, he goes through the preparation of 3 lots of components for 3 meals. The first one is what you call fast food. So he investigated the fast food industry, basically. There were a couple of aspects of that were interesting. One was he realised that a lot of these books are written in America, by this, so a lot of the evidence comes from America rather than this part of the world. He realised that most American children especially have no idea that McDonald's McNuggets are supposed to be chicken. They don't even associate them with chicken. They're McNuggets as far as they're concerned. And they've got, believe it or not, 27 different ingredients. He also, in order to assist his investigation, bought a young bull. So as he owned it, he would be able to follow it through all its various, actually ending up in one of those concentrated feed operations as it happens. He went to see it there. But the one thing they wouldn't let him do was see it being slaughtered. They would not allow him into the slaughterhouse. You know, he didn't really speculate exactly why, but I think we can all guess. He then produced a food which was produced in what he thought was probably an ideal sort of way, really, on a farm that was a mixed farm where everything was rotated around the farm. The animals were kept in a very humane sort of way. They were slaughtered in as humane a way as possible, and produced a very and all the veg and the meat all came from those sorts of farms. But the point he makes out that with 7 billion of us to feed on this planet, I mean, there's no way that is in the least a bit sustainable. The third one was he foraged all the food himself, including shooting a wild boar, which he found very, he still ate it, but he found actually hunting down and shooting a wild boar, you know, quite a disturbing sort of experience, actually. So that's, you know. Before I go on, I'll just diverge slightly. The picture at the beginning was in the Fred Whitten Challenge. Now, you may or may not know about the Fred Whitten Challenge. It's a cycle ride in the Lake District, which, as the name suggests, was set up in sort of memorial of a chap called Fred Whitten, who unfortunately died relatively young from cancer. And he was a keen Cumbrian cyclist, and some of his mates decided they would set up this ride. Now, it's been going for about 10 years now. It's now massive. There were around 4,000 people wanting to ride this year, but they had to ballot it down to 2,000. My son and I were lucky enough to get, well, I say lucky enough, we did get in. And if you know the Lake District, just very quickly, it starts off in Grasmere, goes down through Ambleside, it goes over Kirkstone Pass, which is the highest pass in the lakes. It then goes down to Patterdale, it meanders round eventually to Keswick, down Borrowdale, up Honister, which is where that picture was, down into Buttermere, up Newlands, back down towards Keswick, up over Winlatter, all the way down the coast here to the real killer, which is Hardknot and Rhinos at the end. And it's a total of 112 miles. And we did it. I got off, I think, 3 times to walk. My plan, we actually each raised over £500. So if you raise over £500, you're guaranteed a ride the next year. So I've already been texting my son to say I think we're in for next year. So he's talking about buying a new bike and one thing and another. So we're hoping to ride again, and I'm hoping that I might try and get round without getting off, but I'm not sure whether that's going to be feasible or not. That's actually a sort of profile of it. It is tough. It's regarded as being the toughest bike ride in the UK for one day, but we did it. Now, when I was preparing for that bike ride, I was cycling about 25 miles a day to and from the school I was then at, but that also involved a train ride. So I'd cycle to the station, get on the train, get off in Bradford, and then cycle to the school, which was another 10 miles. And I wondered whether I could actually cycle the whole way, which would be 25 miles each way. So one day I did, and I managed it. So for about 5 months, I wouldn't say I did it there were some weeks when I did it every day. I mean, most weeks I did it most days, but you know, if I was a bit late or Friday afternoon I was feeling a bit tired or the weather was really awful, I might just decide to get the train. But on balance, I generally did it. And at that point, I was actually 2 stone heavier than I am now, and I thought I really need to lose a bit more weight. And it was at that point where I actually cut cheese out of my diet completely. And then I read a book by this guy. This is a guy called Scott Jurek. I don't know whether you've heard of him. I don't really sort of have heroes, but if I do have them, then he would be one of mine. He is an ultramarathon runner. And if you don't know what ultramarathon runners are, they're people who race typically in excess of a normal marathon distance. So if a normal marathon is 26.2 miles, a lot of his races are 100 miles, maybe 150 miles. And he's done it all on a completely plant-based diet. Well, initially he wasn't plant-based, but he gradually moved that way. And this is the book that he wrote about it. And it is truly inspirational. And I was inspired by it. And at the end of every chapter, he's got little recipes and things. When I read that, I thought, this guy's probably right. I mean, to give you an idea of what he's achieved, there's an ultramarathon in Greece called the Spartathlon. I did write down somewhere exactly how far it is. It's 152 miles. And I don't know what his winning time is. You've got to do it in less than 24 hours. And he won it 3 years in succession. Ultramarathon runners also have what they call 24-hour events. Cyclists do as well, actually. So the basic idea is you just run for 24 hours and see how far you can run. And although I think his record has now been broken, he did run 165.7 miles in 24 hours, which is a heck of an achievement. I think his biggest achievement, there's a thing called the Badwater Ultramarathon, which is 135 miles through Death Valley in California. And he won that twice, and I think still holds the record for it. His record is he's regarded as being possibly the best distance runner that there's ever been. His actual marathon times, 26 miles, are not as good as the marathon, but distance-wise, stamina-wise, and he did it on a completely plant-based diet. I also read this around the same time. This guy, Howard F. Lyman, was brought up on a farm. He was a cattle farmer in America. And he really starts off talking about his father dying prematurely from a fairly major heart attack. And he took over the ranch, and then he began to question what he was doing. And a lot of it from the environmental point of view. The environmental degradation in the ranching areas of America is just horrendous. And he eventually came to the conclusion that actually, you shouldn't really be raising cattle in the way that he was, and he shouldn't really be eating meat either. And he became a complete vegan as well. He wrote a second book from this called No More Bull, which I've got, but I must admit I haven't actually read it yet. But if you probably come across this. I mean, this is the book that everyone should read. This guy T. Colin Campbell, when he wrote this book, he was a professor of biochemistry and nutrition at Cornell University. So that's one of the Ivy League universities in America. He was a very credible, top-notch, investigative scientist. And the 2 or 3 things from this book I'll just tell you about very quickly. One was a series of experiments that they carried out using rats. Now, I know if you're anti-exploitation of animals, you probably shouldn't be using rats, but he did. He used rats, and he exposed these rats to a pretty strong carcinogen. It was called aflatoxin, which comes from a fungus. It's often found in peanuts and corn, actually maize. And he split these rats into 2 groups. Obviously, they did this a number of times. It wasn't, it was all scientifically valid. He fed one group of rats on milk protein, and he fed the other group. Well, they both had milk protein. One had a high percentage, one had a very low percentage. And he found, without exception, those with the high percentage developed cancers. Those with the low percentage didn't. I mean, there was no leave. It was 100% totally. Those with the high protein got cancer, those that didn't have high protein didn't. And he began to wonder about that. He was also involved with investigating some rather unfortunate levels of liver cancer being amongst children in the Philippines. Apparently this was a major issue in the Philippines. And he got involved with investigating that, and they discovered that the quality of, believe it or not, the peanut butter in the Philippines and the maize as well, the corn as well, was such that it did have quite high levels of this aflatoxin, and it was causing them to have liver cancers. But these liver cancers, they weren't all getting them. There were two things. First of all, they tend to be confined to the cities, so that's where they were eating a slightly better diet. And within those cities, those that were succumbing to these liver cancers were the ones that had the more affluent families who were eating more meat and dairy products. And you know, he began to put that together a bit with his experiments with the rats and so on. It's called the China Study because a lot of this book is all about a massive investigation in rural areas of China, where much of the population don't eat any dairy products, they actually eat very little meat, and they eat no processed foods whatsoever. Everything's produced from fresh. And in those areas, there is virtually no incidence of cancers, strokes, heart disease, obesity. You know, it's startling, the conclusions that he comes to in this book. And you know, I think a lot of people really ought to read that. He's also convinced. So, actually, I haven't actually read this, but somebody sent me an email recently saying it's a kind of a plant-based diet Bible. So I do intend to get it and read it. But this is supposed to be very good as well. Campbell's also, he's now written this book as well, which has not been published yet. It's been published early next year. But the interesting thing here is, he says it's a simple way to lose weight and reverse illness. He has proved, he now has a thing called the, Centre for Nutrition Studies in America. It's got a website, nutritionstudies.org. He's pretty well proved that in the early stages of cancers, in the stages of coronary heart disease before it's got too serious, you know, these conditions can be reversed by cutting all animal products out and going on a completely plant-based diet. I mean, in his book, The China Study, he talks about cancers having 3 stages. There's the initiation of the cancer. Well, as I'm sure you know, cancers start in a single cell. You know, we've each got possibly 100 trillion cells, but it only takes one cell to mutate that could possibly develop into a cancer. Now, I'm quite sure that all of us have cells that become cancerous all the time. But they never develop, you know, they die. I mean, obviously, sometimes they develop. So the next stage is this sort of proliferation of those cells. They grow and they form a mass, a tumour. And, you know, the really serious aspect thereafter is when, you know, cells break off those tumours, metastasis, and they move to other parts of the body. He is totally convinced that most cancers proliferate when they're fed animal proteins. Not plant proteins, animal proteins. And, you know, maybe he's right. I did read something, again, I think it was only this week, that they're beginning to suspect that rising levels of lactose intolerance in America is being correlated to falling levels of certain cancers. So as people are eating less dairy product in America, they're also reducing the number of people succumbing to various cancers.